Welcome. My name is Dr. Eva Fisher, and I am on part 5 of how I recovered from body dysmorphic disorder. When I left off in part 4, I had referred myself for treatment, and I was diagnosed with depression rather than body dysmorphic disorder because back when I self-diagnosed and referred myself to treatment, BDD was not really in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of mental health that psychiatrists and psychologists use to diagnose people with mental health conditions. So I was diagnosed with depression. However, I had depression along with anxiety due to having BDD about my nose and my face. So that was an accurate diagnosis. Unfortunately, I was put on Prozac, which is an SSRI, which is an antidepressant, but it's also been shown to effectively alleviate the symptoms of body dysmorphic disorder. I do want to mention that although I am not certainly encouraging anyone to get onto medication, I will say that both the talk therapy that I had and being on Prozac for 2 years, both of those really helped to alleviate my BDD symptoms in such a way that I was no longer obsessed about my nose. I no longer thought it was fat and ugly. I didn't spend hours and hours and hours thinking about my nose every day. I didn't stare at my nose in the mirror, my face in the mirror, picking at my skin for hours at a time every day. And as I mentioned in the last video, my mom, before she passed away from breast cancer, was able to really notice that, I was happier, I was smiling more. I was just, making eye contact more with people. My psychiatrist told me that. She's like, wow, you didn't even make eye contact with me when you started. And then once the Prozac started working, she's like, now you're making eye contact with me. You're looking up when you're talking to me. And I hadn't even realized how shut in or how shut down I had been when I had the body dysmorphic disorder. I do want to mention, though, that there were 2 parts to my recovery story, and I'll just briefly talk about the second part. So the first part was using the talk therapy and the Prozac to help alleviate my symptoms, and that happened over the course of about 2 years. However, and that was great, and I would say my symptoms were definitely subclinical, at a subclinical level after that 2 years. However, I didn't want to be on Prozac for the rest of my life, even though my psychiatrist had told me I was a lifer, meaning I would be on it for the rest of my life. So I actually, through ultra running and the community of ultra running, my running coach, because I was racing at the time, so I had a running coach, she knew someone who did more what would be considered, I think, somatic therapy. So muscle testing, more looking at how my feelings were resonating in my body. And she introduced me to meditation. I started meditating for 2 hours every week after I did my runs on the weekend. And she also helped me to use meditation to slowly get off the Prozac. Again, it is possible, you don't have to be on medication for the rest of your life, possibly, although some people are. I was able to use meditation to slowly get myself off using the Prozac. I also want to mention, however, I was on a very low dose of Prozac. I was only on 20 milligrams, which is fairly standard for someone with depression. People with BDD can be prescribed higher dosages of medications, but I was on a fairly low dosage, so I was able to use meditation to to relieve the stress and anxiety as well once my BDD symptoms were under control. Also, using the somatic therapy and the meditation, and the help of my counselor at the time, I was able to start looking at some of the negative core beliefs that I had and some of the childhood trauma I had gone through. My parents did not have a happy marriage. My father was fairly verbally abusive to my mother. I internalized a lot of that hostility between my parents when I was young. And also my mother, because I could have my own meltdowns, I was kind of volatile, but more that I would have crying fits when I was a child more than anger like my father. But my mother still compared my temperament to my father's when I was younger, when I was an adolescent and a child. And I would have these kind of temper tantrums, and she would say, stop behaving like your father, or, you don't want to grow up to be like your father. And I just felt that in some way she was telling me I was fatally genetically flawed to be like my father. And I internalized that when I was younger as a child. I didn't realize until I had, my second round of therapy, so to speak, the somatic therapy, really understanding that I had internalized that to mean that I was fatally flawed, that there was just no chance of my not ending up like my father, which is, my father loved us children. He was, in his own way, he was loving, but he was also, he was very hurt. Both my parents had dysfunctional relationships with their mothers, and he was very hurt by his mother, and he really he had problems experiencing his emotions. And so I came to understand that both my parents were loving people, but also flawed. And the marriage was just not good for either one of them, unfortunately. I was able to understand that somehow by internalizing this negativity and this feeling of rejection by my mother, or feeling that she was rejecting the part of me that was like my father, I had come to believe that, there was something really fatally, awfully wrong with me. And on some level, I was unlovable because I felt like if my mother hated my father and there was a part of me that was like my father, then there must be a part of me she hated as well. Although she never said it. And it was certainly something I probably internalized unconsciously for many, many years. But I really feel that the BDD was more of a Band-Aid protecting me from that really negative feeling, because as hard as BDD is, and as hard as it is to feel that, we're being rejected because people feel we're ugly, or, we're being rejected because there's something about us that people find, unattractive. It's not, and I kind of gravitated towards that, I think consciously, because my parents were both artists, because I'm very aware of appearance, because it was easy to look in the mirror and tell myself that my mom was, the feelings that I was feeling about myself was because there was something about my appearance my mother didn't like, rather than, it took many years to understand and to come to the realization that somehow I had internalized these messages that I had been gotten from my mother, and the dysfunction between my parents as, the world is not safe. I'm, it's, I'm not being accepted and loved for who I am. And somehow it's based on my appearance. And that's, I believe, how the BDD manifested itself for me, at least. So once I came to realize that, once I was able to look at those beliefs and understand that those were most likely false beliefs, because my mom did love me and she was a very loving mother, although she was critical, and she didn't approve of my behavior in those moments, certainly. But I think really she would have understood. Both of my parents, by the way, passed in 2000. But I think she would have understood that we can change, right? We're not fatally flawed to be like our parents. And I certainly felt that once I realized that, I've done a lot of things in my power to change my behavior, to improve my communication, and to be sure that, I look at myself as someone who's lovable and acceptable, that really has nothing to do with my appearance. And once I realized that, and once I was able to come to that conclusion, I feel like that's how I really recovered from the BDD and the depression and the anxiety that I had suffered for so many years. So that's the second part of my recovery story that I wanted to share in these videos. And then finally, in part 6, I will come back and share a little bit about my life since I recovered from body dysmorphic disorder. Thank you very much.